I don't want to talk too long. I just want to set the stage for our amazing discussion tonight. And so I'll only say a couple of things. PEN America is an organization that came to this work because we focus on issues at the nexus of literature and human rights around the world, and specifically in the United States. So from your right to protest, to journalists' rights to access the state capitol and report on issues of public import, to very complex digital issues, around how the online world is affecting us. We are engaging in various ways around the country, and we recently launched several chapter cities, Detroit being one of them, and our new chapter leaders are here tonight. We're going to be working over the next several months trying to figure out what it is that you guys want to be talking about and ways that we can partner with you to elevate the things that matter. And in furtherance of that work, we began looking several months ago at the local news crisis around the country. The way that we were seeing, as I think a lot of us in this room know, that around the country there has been a terrible crisis affecting journalism, part of that due to the advent of the digital age and the loss in revenue for newspapers and for other models for funding and for revenue for various kinds of media industry organizations. And so one of the things we noticed was that people are less engaged if they're not getting their news, if they're not getting critical information. And I'm not sure that's a very wild or foreign concept. It seems rather logical, doesn't it? That if you're not able to feel connected or even have access to news, you're not going to know about certain things. Perhaps that's your child's education or healthcare issues or other critical local information, like where your voting location and polling location is, when local elections happen. And so all of this is a cascading effect. And really, I think at the core of it, it affects our democratic engagement. And so PEN America, over the course of the last year, investigated what the local news crisis looked like across the country. And I have to say, it felt like we could not do that and not actually work with local communities on local news. And so it was really serendipitous, and it was an honor that we got to partner with Martina Guzmán, who is here. And she authored one of our 3 case studies, which took a deep dive into local media landscape issues. And so our other 2 focus on rural representation in North Carolina, as well as then the local ecosystem in Denver. And tonight, because one of our case studies focuses on the Detroit media landscape, we felt it incumbent to do something in Detroit. And what better than to partner with Martina and with other leading media experts who are working every day on local news issues to talk about the topics that we have here, whether it is from race and representation to the issue of trust in local media. We wanted to bring everyone here together to be able to just open up space to have this conversation. And in our putting our report together at PEN, one thing really dawned on us is that we could not exclusively look at the way revenue or the loss in revenue caused the local news crisis, but that part and parcel of what we've seen in people's decreasing ability to access and engage with democratic institutions is that media must be then responsive and engaged with communities. That the media must listen to and tell stories that accurately reflect what's going on in our communities. And it was really a wonderful honor to get to work with Martina as she wrote this case study exploring the very deeply entrenched issues affecting the local media here in Detroit. And I don't want to take any more time. I hope I have set the stage a little bit to give you some sort of urgency around why we're here tonight. I am very excited for both Martina as well as our panel that follows. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Martina Guzmán, and then Curt Guyette will be on stage with her to help sort of facilitate her keynote address, which will really dive deeper into her case study. So will you join me in a round of applause for Martina Guzmán?
PEN America called me in very late winter of 2019 and told me that they were embarking on this incredible project to look at the media ecosystem, that they understood that media was in crisis and that they wanted to address it. And as part of their work of freedom of expression, that it was important and incumbent on them to write a report that talked about the many issues facing journalists and corporate media and the media landscape in the US. And when they asked if I would write the Detroit case study, I said yes. I mean, we went back and forth quite a bit. But the most important thing for me was that I reported on members of the community, period. Like that if I didn't write first and foremost from the perspective of Detroit, then this wasn't something I wanted to be interested in. And Penn and Victoria and Nora and being who they are, were like, absolutely, that's exactly what we want. And to be able to go into that with that idea, telling the perspective of Detroiters, was something that I had been wanting to do for years. I spent an enormous amount of time thinking about Detroit, thinking about media in Detroit, thinking about what journalists write and how they write and why they write. And so for me, this was an ability to sort of get all of that out and work with an organization whose foundation was in journalism and freedom. So to the key findings, I found a couple of things. One of the things, the main points, was that there is a real distrust between communities in Detroit and with legacy media outlets. It is incredibly fractured. It feels broken, and community people have a lot to say about it. They are informed, they're intelligent, and they think about it a lot. And I used two case studies as an example. One of them, the first case study, was the Detroit Little Caesars Arena. You know, I remember when the, oh my God, I'm blanking out on the name. The Bryant Gumbel piece came out for Real Sports, and how all of a sudden everyone began writing, not once, not twice, over and over and over again, reiterating what Bryant Gumbel had gotten right. Was that why were you taking money that went to schools for Black children in Detroit and using it to build an arena? And for me, that was the fundamental issue. Like, that was critically important to me. And I was happy to see everyone else writing about it. I was thrilled to see people writing about it. But at that point, it was too late. The money was given to them. You know, deals were made, land was swapped, and it was over. And it isn't that everyone didn't write about it. You know, people wrote about it, but it wasn't enough. And when we did a critical analysis of it, where we took several hundred articles that were written, 80% of them took a slant towards a positive view of Little Caesars Arena. That what was happening was sort of pro-development, and that this was a good thing for Detroit. And I was sort of astounded by that, you know? That I didn't think it was that to that degree, but it was. And what I realized was that there was an issue that needed to be looked at, that why was this? Why was it that people weren't telling the story from the perspective of the community? And when I interviewed community members, I mean, I have 30 hours worth of tape of interviews. And when I interviewed members of the community, they told me, we went to those meetings. We expressed our point of view. We knew that this would have problems and issues. And we weren't listened to us. No one listened to us. No one would interview us about what we had to say. And that was very telling to me. And the other example I use is the Detroit water shutoffs, and how that was something that was really a smack into the face to many African Americans in the city of Detroit. That it was never looked at as something that they saw clearly that was a public health issue. That how could you turn water off to Black people in Detroit, Black women in Detroit, knowing that Detroit has more than 40% single parent households, women raising children and grandchildren, and that water could be turned off without having articles that had, in addition to talking about the water issue, but also saying this is the level of poverty in the city of Detroit. This is the level of illiteracy in the city of Detroit. And hey, guess what? Detroit actually has really pays high rates of water. And I used those two because I felt that they were the most significant examples of the distrust and how that distrust had evolved and developed. Like it was sort of like a critical moment in the last several years. And, everyone was incredibly forthcoming about why they felt what they felt. And I was able to sort of look at that and sort of lay it out and say, okay, well, now we have this issue. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we can look at what to do, but the fact that reporters aren't asking critical questions and the fact that reporters often don't go into communities is problematic.
One of the things about the Little Caesar Arena deal is that it was going on as the city was going through bankruptcy. So you have a city that is taking away healthcare benefits from retirees, cutting their pensions, at the same time that millions of tax dollars are going to help enrich a family that's already billionaires. And it always seemed that there was really just an absence of outrage at something on its very face seems outrageous.
There was a culture. Look, journalists aren't perfect. We make a lot of mistakes. And, we often also like to kind of look at ourselves and sort of examine those mistakes. And during the Little Caesars Arena deal and the water shutoffs, which were all kind of happening at the same time, news people vocally, in my experience, took a stand. I mean, I had a journalist tell me to my face, we're not going to report on water because people need to pay their bills. That dripped in contempt to me. What did that say if you thought about that? Not only is it bad journalism to not cover it from every single solitary angle, but the mere fact that you said that said volumes to, as a reporter. And though we're guilty of having people in newsrooms that way, and when the Detroit bankruptcy was happening, there was this culture, I remember, that this was a good thing, that we were going to clean the slate and everything was going to be great after that. And that there should have been more critical outrage and more stories told from the perspective of community members to balance out this kind of corporate, this is good for Detroit sort of sentiment.
So do you think that reflected both a class bias and also a racist aspect that was prevalent in media?
Yes. The entire subtext of the piece was from the hours and hours of interviews that I'd done from people who felt this way. That why weren't you coming into the Detroit community? Journalists giving me examples, and many off the record, that didn't want to end up in the piece, that didn't want to go into communities, that they would drive past them on the freeways, but they weren't willing to go into them and report on those issues, and it had to be said. I mean, I felt that I couldn't dance around the issue of race. We are 50 years after the Kerner Commission, where these issues were brought up, and we are still experiencing them. We are still talking about the same things the commission and the report talked about 50 years ago. And if that's happening, then something's wrong. We are not looking at the right thing. And the right thing to look at, based on the reporting, was the issue of race and people's inherent bias and how they looked at certain communities and whether they were afraid or not afraid. But there was definitely a schism there. There was definitely something that was breached and needed to be repaired. Needs to be still.
I thought that your study had sort of two prongs to it. One is where you're talking about to the extent which severe revenue reductions resulting from technological innovations and cuts engineered by the hedge fund managers that increasingly control media excuse me, are severely impacting the ability of legacy media to generate meaningful local news stories. You point out, for example, that the Free Press has cut 2/3 of its staff since 1995. Obviously, that's not a good thing for democracy. On the other hand, I think you were saying these same legacy media have long suffered from a kind of corporate mainstream bias and severe lack of diversity. And those problems existed long before the economic crisis the media has been experiencing in the past several decades. So, in a way, it feels like we might be lamenting the diminishing of an influence that was not all that great an influence.
So, have newsrooms diminished? Yes, substantially. To the point that that was the impetus for the report that Penn did, that we had to address this, that newsrooms were closing, and this is bad for democracy when people are not informed. So that was an issue. And, how newspapers make money was not something that I know how to tackle and not know how to, sort of expand upon. And I don't think the biggest people in the industry know how to talk about it either. They're figuring it out too. But what I did notice, and what I did seem to understand, was that even as the newsrooms were shrinking, there was still, even with the reporters that were left in the newsrooms, a desire, or not a desire, an inability to go into communities that they should have gone into, to talk about mass transit, to talk about education, to talk about a public health crisis that you might not know about. That there was still that sort of apprehension of the communities in and around in the neighborhoods of Detroit. And so I began to think, well, if it's 50 years after the Kerner Commissions and we have the same problems, and in addition that our newsrooms are shrinking dramatically, but the reporters still aren't reporting in the neighborhoods, then what's the real problem? And it's something else. I hope I answered your question. So,
starting back in the 1990s, there was much talk about the internet leading to the democratization of news. No more would the New York Times and CBS and other corporate media be the sole gatekeepers on the flow of information. Do you think that the promise of that has materialized?
I do. Maybe not as robustly as people have thought, but in this room alone, there's Outlier Media, there's Tostada Magazine, there's hopefully Riverwise, but they actually do a printed edition as well. We have the Griot, we have the Root, we have, Thrillist and Eater and Curb Detroit, all of these media platforms that would not have existed had the internet not, been invented and evolved in the way that it did. And so we're informed in a completely different way. And I also think that people worked in institutions or places that didn't represent their values, that they decided that they wanted to go do something else, that they said, I can do this in a different way, or I want to do this in a different way. You have an incredible example in Chicago where a group of media people left the organizations that they worked with and invented their own. And they rooted it centered on communities, that you could not report in a community if you had not spent months there getting to know who the leaders were. And that seems groundbreaking, and they've been lauded over and over for it, but it's not. It's what our job is. And while we have these new outlets, via the internet, we still have legacy media that has to, pay people and have salaries and produce television and get a newspaper out. And they still have to do those things. So I think that while it's good to have all of these new outlets, it also makes it dangerous for some of the legacy media outlets that still need to survive and that are critical to a democracy, that are important to how we view the world.
Do you think it's been a double-edged sword to some extent because it also opened the way for Breitbart and InfoWars and right-wing propaganda that sows hate and division.
Yes, but I also fundamentally believe like in the role of the journalist, you know, that even though there is Breitbart, even though that there are these sort of outlets that push conspiracy theories and propaganda, that our role and the respect that journalists get, that's eroding, and that's another problem. But they are determined to tell the stories. They inherently understand that this information is critical to our democracy. And it's so critical, it's so important. And you know, I don't know if Breitbart and those outlets think in this framework. I don't think that if they think like, oh, you know, we're important to the democratic process. But I only know the perspective from the world that I work in. And the role of the journalist is so important that it is the only job in the United States Constitution. The only job. That's how important it is. But I know that my colleagues take that very seriously. They understand that, they know that, they understand that they are a pillar of democracy, and I feel that no matter what, even if there is a Breitbart, even if there is another media outlet that's more than conservative, they push propaganda, that the journalists that I know and that I work with are gonna always stand out because of who they are and what they do.
I got my first newspaper job in 1983. That same year, Ben Bagdikian published his groundbreaking book, The Media Monopoly, which sounded the alarm about the dangers of media consolidation by pointing out that just 50 corporations owned 90% of the media at the time. In 2017, PBS reported that 5 corporations now dominate the industry. So we have this media consolidation that is going on, and the resulting job cuts. That's not a new thing, it's just progressing and progressing and progressing. And given the media landscape, what's going on, what would you tell young people that are considering a career in journalism?
To do it over and over and over again. And I'm involved with a community of journalists, of Black journalists and journalists of color in Detroit, and I encourage them to write, to report, to tell the truth regardless. And you know, right now, Mike Bloomberg is running for president of the United States. This is how that problem sort of lays out into a national scenario. He's basically told the people from Bloomberg News that they cannot report on him. That is so devastatingly wrong, outrageous. And I've seen stories on it, but not in the way that I had expected to see stories. Like, that is such an incredible problem that I almost feel like I don't have the vocabulary to talk about how wrong and how bad that is. You know? The Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press are part of a corporate entity, and that comes with its own set of issues and own set of problems. And they have to deal with that while trying to make money every day. But if there's corporate control, sort of trying to tell journalists what they need to be writing, that's another really big problem that we need to like keep our eye open about. And this is the first time I've ever seen it with like Mike Bloomberg manifested so clearly into society. You know, we'd always known that there was people kind of behind the scenes going, don't do a story that, I'm gonna kill this. Like, let's be real, it happens. But this was something I've never anticipated, you know, to actually see this and to see not see the kind of response that I'd hoped for. Yep. Thank you so much.
So we have the honor of so many talented people. While I am just introducing our panel, Curt is our pinch hit everything, and he will stay on stage. Martina might be too humble, I'm not sure, but one of the most remarkable aspects, I think, to the case study that she wrote was the breadth, the volume, and the depth of the interviews. If we're really going to talk about democracy and local media, I think we have to then talk about representation and provide a breadth of voices. And when we envisioned together what tonight would look like, it just didn't feel like we could only have something about this case study. And part of what we wanted was to be able to provide real space for people to react and to share their stories. And I imagine that it will be, I hope, the first of dialogues for us in this space and on this topic. And so I am really honored to share with you all this panel, this group of amazing people. I turned and none of them were there. But so let me call everyone up now. Our panel is featuring three wonderful voices from the Detroit media scene. You already know Curt Guyette, who will join us here. In addition, we have Sarah Alvarez of Outlier Media, Vincent McCraw. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Wonderful. And moderating tonight, Ken Coleman. And I am just so honored to have all of them. So thank you. And one more round of applause for Martina.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Nope. Coming through? No? Sorry. That was hot. Good evening to you all. Give Martina another round of applause. Outstanding, outstanding work. And I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
Let's get right into it, panel. Certainly, Martina gave us a lot to sort of think about and chew on. And what we'll do is I'll have a couple questions. I understand if there are questions in the audience, we'll have an opportunity to address some of those too. Let me start, ladies first.
Okay.
Sarah.
Okay.
Martina talked about it in the conversation with her, but let me ask you, do we have a trust problem when it comes to media, Sarah, and the community that it covers? Do we have a trust problem?
Yeah, I think we do. Does this work? No. Oh, is this okay if I project? No. Okay. Pass. We do have a trust problem. I think partly because we have a value problem, right? So I think that, it is difficult to provide news that is of real value to a community because it's expensive to produce news. It can be slow, and I do think that, the Breitbarts and the InfoWars notwithstanding, everybody really wants to do a good job and provide a valuable service. When you're a reporter, like that's what you try to sign up to do. But if you're not providing something that is really valuable to residents, then why should they trust in you? It is, we have such a position of privilege, and I think that part of what is difficult as a reporter is to navigate that space between trying to be fair and objective and trying to be of service, right? And I think that can be very difficult for some people. And so I think there can be like an overcompensating of wanting to be objective and feeling like you need to be objective and really separating yourself from the needs of a community and the information needs of a community. And so that breaks down trust.
I appreciate that. Vincent, it certainly occurs to me that you spent had a very robust career in journalism actively. You're still very much part of it. You helped to lead the National Association of Black Journalists, Detroit chapter. You've been in this town for quite a while. Is there a trust problem between media in general and the community that it serves?
Well, the short answer is yes. A lot of what Sarah said, but it's also if all, and let's just talk, since the city is 79-80% black, since the city is 79-89% black, let's talk about that. If all the community at large in Detroit sees is the crime du jour every night, every day, on TV, or some sensational, and this is not to say that they should not be covered, but if that's all they see, then no, there's no trust there. If you're not going into those communities, neighborhood, to find out dig a little deeper as to why perhaps that's happening, particularly if they're serial shootings or homicides or those kinds of crimes in that community, then why should they trust you? So yes, there is a trust. You have to, and Martina noted that reporters need to be out in the community, but it goes a little higher than that. Managers and leaders in newsrooms,
Assignment editors.
need to assign them, but they also have to have the mindset that needs to be a priority for their coverage. It can't just be the reporters. Some don't want to go. Some are for all the reasons that we wish people wouldn't think about the city and how they see it. There are reporters who hold those thoughts and don't want to go. So there are a lot of reasons. I mean, those are just sort of skimming the surface. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why there's some distrust of the media in this town.
Sure.
Can you speak up?
Sure.
You're not hearing you.
Okay. Is this on?
Well, yeah, you're just got to talk directly into
Oh, I got to
it.
talk directly into it like that.
Yeah, radio
Okay.
voice.
All right, I'll do that.
Broadcast. Curt, you've been around the block a few times. Certainly award-winning coverage at the Metro Times. That thought to be part of that institution, that thought to be part of legacy media. But same question to you. Is there a trust problem between media in general and the community that it serves?
I think there probably is and isn't. I think most people, or not most people, but I think that there's much higher trust in local media than there is in national media. And it's because they're closer to it and they can see that a lot of time what's being reported is factual stuff. But I also think that there is really this kind of corporate bias. And you don't necessarily have to tell people what they can or cannot do, it's who you hire. And, mainstream media is not going to hire people that are radical bomb throwers because that's not the way the model is built on. And so it's part of it, it's just the whole corporate structure. Part of it is in the way that people are trained to be journalists. You get beat into your head, objectivity. And I was very fortunate early on to end up in the alternative press, where my first editor at the alternative paper I worked for said, look, I don't expect you to be objective. I don't even really think that you can be objective. But what I do want you to be is fair. And that was like a light going off. It's like, oh my gosh, now I found a home and so like at the Metro Times, we were openly liberal. And we didn't pretend that we were anything other than that.
Now explain that for people that might not be journalists and that the objectivity. So an ideological bent, are you talking about in your news coverage or more your opinion side or editorial side?
Well, for me, it manifested itself in the kinds of stories that I would choose to cover. But then the flip side of that is once you do it, then and again, not necessarily objective, but certainly fair. Because if you're not, you're not going to have credibility. And if you don't have credibility as a journalist, you're worthless. because people are just not going to believe you. So you have to bring the facts. But once you launch an investigation, then the cards have to fall where the cards have to fall. So a lot of times the impetus, though, was to, like, say, covering Maddie Maroon when no one else is covering Maddie Maroon in a critical way, or writing in a critical way about what's going on with building these stadiums that have been shown over and over again to be a really bad investment for communities to make because they lose. But the papers are promoting it because sports coverage is such a huge part of it. And geez, can you imagine what it would be like at the Free Press if, you know, the Lions and Tigers had been sold, and they left the area? That would be devastating to them. So there's a certain self-interest that they're going to promote those things, and maybe not even think about it, but just accept it as a good thing because it's a good thing for them. And so I always saw as the alternative media is to bring in an alternative perspective to things. And like someone I worked with at one point said, sacred cows make the best hamburger. You know, if you were going after things that other people aren't going, like I would tell, when I was an editor, I would tell my reporters, my whole thought process was either we're going to cover things that people aren't covering, or we're going to cover things that people are covering in a different way that they're covering. Because I thought there was really, truly value in bringing alternative perspectives to the news media.
Yeah. Let me add. That's,
I'm sorry.
I just want, Curt mentioned radical bomb throwers. I'm not sure that you have to be in legacy media anyway, radical bomb throwers. I think you just have to hire those who give a damn. Who you know, too much of the coverage in this town, a lot of the coverage, of course, is about the quote-unquote comeback of Detroit.
right.
Well, that means downtown, midtown.
The 7.2 square miles.
Square miles. Well, you know, how many folks who actually live in the city, work in the city, get tired of hearing that?
Well,
And you're missing what may be going on where they live.
so I think you're onto something. So let's stay there. I think that certainly Martina and Curt pointed out in the first session of the program tonight. This is a town that is upwards of actually more than 80% people of color. It's certainly 80% African American. Yet you go through newsrooms and it's not reflective. I mean, let's talk, Vince. Look, I mean, I think right now, for example, and I'm going to the editorial opinion side, but this is a majority black town, a super majority people of color town, but there's nobody on the editorial board of either Legacy Daily that looks like the people that live in these communities. That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, certainly, absolutely, it's a problem. I think, and one news has one black editorial writer,
But not really on the board.
Not on the board.
Not making editorial decision part of the decision.
Free, I think, doesn't have anyone. So that is an issue.
That shapes coverage.
It shapes the ideology and the thought of those two newspapers. I will also suggest to you that because there are no longer black or people of color columnists at either paper, that has the same effect, that there is no longer the reflection of those communities through local columnists.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a difference too.
Yeah. Sarah, you guys are changing the game at Outlier. I mean, this is a new platform, right? Giving people news where they receive it almost in real time, on their phone, maybe on their desktop. Our organizations and outlets like Outlier, changing the game, providing more opportunity for people of color.
Well, we are an all women of color shop, right? Our CEO is Candace Fortman.
Give her some love,
Incredible,
yeah. Give her some
right?
love.
But we're also really small. There's 3 of us. So, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do really is provide a service to Detroiters. We have a texting service. If you want to try it, you can. You can text the word Detroit to the number 73224, and I can tell you what that is again later. And you can get information that you need about housing and utilities right on your phone. So it's not a very traditional news service, although it is very traditionally reported. And what we're trying to do, both in how we structure our newsroom and our organization, and in terms of the way that we cover things, is we're trying to kind of be an intervention, right? Like, we saw that there was, that the way that housing, well, first of all, let me step back, I'm sorry, but like, what we wanted to do was say, we are reporters, there's not very many of us, and there's not very many reporters in this whole city. So where can we add the most value? And we wanted to be able to add the most value by looking at where there were the greatest information needs. And because I believe in reporters, obviously, I believe that we're good at our jobs, but I also believe everybody has a lot of bias, and I don't want to be in charge of deciding what's important. I want to be responsive to what other people think are important. And so what we did was look at a bunch of data from the United Way to find out what people were calling into the 211 service about most. And that was clearly housing and utilities. So that's what we cover, housing and utilities, right? And we're giving people information that they can use to create accountability for themselves. Because my background and my skill set is as a watchdog reporter. But I know that if there's only a newsroom of 3 people, well, 2 people, or an organization of 3, but there's 2 of us on the news side, like, we cannot be watchdogs for housing for the city of Detroit, right? It's a pretty crowded space with a lot of stuff going on. So what we're trying to do is kind of like redistribute that watchdog function to people in the city, to residents, to block club captains, to everybody. And we've been pretty successful at that because I think we're interested in sharing that power. That's not something that I think is, natural to most people, and especially to journalists. But I think it's really necessary if we're going to continue to exist in this space where there are fewer reporters, and where to show our value and to increase this trust, we have to prove our value every day. And I think we prove our value by being clear about what our job is, what we can do, how we do our job, and trying to be responsive to what people say they need.
Got it. I'm going to pose this question to all 3 of you, but start with Curt. I remember being a journalism student in this space, on this campus, 27, 28, 29 years ago. And great journalists, people like Ben Burns, that headed the J School at the time, and different professors would almost say that if you're going to be sort of a working reporter, and I'm thinking more on the print side, but you should really sort of stay away from being, a member of the Detroit branch NAACP, or a precinct delegate with one of the congressional district organizations. That you needed that objectivity, and with fairness that you talked about, Curt, but you needed that objectivity. And we were really sort of discouraged from being part of the community in that way. Let's move to some strategies on how trust can be built. Can one be a member of a community, but not part of that fabric, those institutions, maybe a member at a leading church? I mean, how does that look for you, Curt?
Oh boy, I've always, to a certain extent, have stayed apart. Partly because that's kind of my nature. I'm not really a joiner in things, and so I've been more of an observer. But I want to go back to the diversity issue, and how the lack of diversity isn't just kind of wrong, but it's really stupid, because by not being diverse, you are missing out on good stories. Metro Times is not the most diverse paper in the world. And I was always pushing for it, not just because, like, I was trying to be morally superior, but that it makes you a better paper. The more diverse you are, the more contacts you have with various communities, and you're going to be finding stories that you would not have found otherwise. And so it's the diversity is crucial, and they're shooting themselves in the head by not being diverse because they are missing out on all sorts of good stories.
So we're talking skin color, we're talking
Gender,
sexual orientation,
class things, all sorts of
I
things.
just wanted you to define what you meant by
Yes.
diversity.
And the more diverse you are, the stronger you're going to be as a news organization. And the lack of diversity, I think, is part of the reason for the problems that they're having. That they are not diverse and not just connecting with people, but coming up with stories. Because the other thing I really believe is that good investigative journalism attracts readers, it attracts viewers. And when I first got hired at the ACLU, one of the questions they asked is they said, well, how are you going to get your stories out there? And I said, I don't really know the answer to that, but here's what I do know. If I'm doing a good job, it's going to get out there. And one of the, Flint became a worldwide story, which just goes to prove the point that good investigative reporting is good for business in the sense that you are going to get people reading you or watching you if you're doing a good job.
And let me point out for folks that don't know, Curt would probably never say this, but his reporting on the Flint water crisis was stellar. So much so that that year, or the year after his groundbreaking reporting, he was bestowed the honor of Michigan Journalist of the Year, I do believe, right, Curt?
Although the Pulitzer Committee declined my application because they said I'm not a journalist. So who's a journalist and who's not a journalist is also part of what's going on now as this democratization goes on.
That's actually a great segue. Vincent, you've been involved in journalism, not only in this market but in others. And let me go back to the point about trust and being a member of being a part of the fabric of a community. Why can't I go to the leading church in town? Why can't I be a card-carrying member of the NAACP or the ACLU? What difference does that make in terms of how I cover it?
Here's my take on it. If you live in a community as a reporter or an editor or a journalist, if you live in a community, you have neighbors, you go to the grocery store, you go to the church, presumably you're talking to people, what's the problem? That informs, it should, your thinking and how you see, how you report on that community.
Sources.
Relationships. I don't mean necessarily intimate relationships. I mean, relationships for sourcing. I mean, if you are a part of your community as a journalist, then there shouldn't be a problem. I mean, I'm not too bothered by that. I used to get that kind of admonition from editors as well. Oh, don't be a part of this, don't be a part of that. And I went ahead and was a part of it. Because I understood what I was doing, and I also understood what my job was. And I didn't think that would be one of the reasons I've been hired over the years in this business is because of the experiences that I bring to the job and the life and lived experiences. So why would I divorce myself from that?
Sarah, curious, your reaction.
I just think you need to be transparent about it, right? I think that when you're interviewing somebody, right? If I was working on a story and I'm interviewing somebody, I'm asking them all kinds of questions about not just what they think and what they've experienced, but why, right? So I feel like we need to also do that, right? It's the respectful thing to do. So I don't know. What we just try to do at Outlier is be transparent about the communities that we are a part of, and then if we feel like there's a conflict, to disclose it. But there is, right? Like, even if you're covering housing, if you're a homeowner, your experience is really different than if you're a renter. And those are important distinctions that nobody's ever going to say, like, well, if you're a reporter, you cannot be a renter, right? If you're a housing reporter, you can't do this, right? But those are really important distinctions. So I think we just need to be transparent about the types of groups that we belong to. And I try to be really careful about the types of efforts I sign on to, but I also think that's like Curt was saying, he's not much of a joiner. Same, right? I don't want to have like a public life as a reporter where like I don't express any opinions, but then in my personal life I'm expressing all kinds of opinions, right? Like journalists need to be the same in public as they are in private. I always feel like if I'm saying something in private that I wouldn't want in public, that's how you know you've kind of crossed a line as a reporter.
I'm curious, as we're certainly in a social media age where everybody's got a smartphone seemingly. Most folks have some type of social media handle. Who's on Facebook? Or show of hands.
Not me.
Who's on Twitter? Show of hands.
Okay.
Who's on the gram, as my son would call it? Show of hands. Great. And that's what my general sense was. For our panel, here's something that it's been sort of bandied about in journalism circles and public relations circles. How do y'all feel about having a social media page, being on one of the mediums, and within the context of that, offering your opinion, even on things that you may report on? Is that out of bounds? Do you have a private life, Curt, where you can opine on how you think the governor's doing or the mayor's doing, and still cover that elected official?
Well, again, being in the alternative press, we have a little bit more leeway to be expressive. Like, I didn't ever have to really pretend about who I was. It was kind of open, and in that regard. And again, that was kind of a liberating aspect of it, and why I enjoyed it so much. But I did want to make one point about being parts of communities. You also have to risk becoming a pariah in that community. If there's things going on in that community that you expose, you risk alienating yourself from aspects of that community. So, you need a lot of moral courage in that sense. I think a lot about the Ibsen play, Enemy of the People, which is now a very, very common phrase thanks to our president. But the whole premise of that play was that this town had a healing water spa that was being developed, and it was getting a lot of business, and the town was booming because of it. And then the doctor in that town found out that because of a tannery upstream, there was something in the water that was actually making people sick. And when he tried to expose that, everybody, including his brother who was the mayor, including the publisher of the local newspaper, attacked him for telling the truth. And so one thing that I think is a badge of honor, every time we're called enemy of the people, it's like I own up to that, because if telling the truth makes you an enemy of the people, then we should be proud of being considered an enemy of the people.
Gotcha.
I tend to tell young journalists and those even some who've been in the business quite some time, when it comes to social media, tread carefully. Mm-hmm. Because just because you say that these opinions are yours, well, who reads that? Who sees that disclaimer? No one. And if you are working for a media outlet, and particularly if you're public, people know you from TV, see you on TV as a reporter, or they know your byline, then they're not going to make that distinction. And your personal opinions can be construed as those of your employer or your prospective employer. Prospective employer may, because now people check social media.
I've had editors tell me that they consider it to be fair game.
They do. They see what kind of social media life you're living. And if it's not what they deem appropriate, so I I would tread carefully. Even I now, I don't have a lot of thoughts. But I don't. Plus, I'm not one that every time I have a thought to want to share it on social media. I just keep it to myself, or I tell my cat. but I think reporters, journalists need to be careful about that, because while they think that they're commenting and they're on their own time, they are still, particularly if they're not freelancers,
Right.
and they're tied to some media,
To a beat
or something, then people will see that, they may see that differently and react that way.
Sarah, any thought on
I'm too boring for social No, I mean, there is an amazing podcast, and there's a book that it accompanies right now. It's called The View from Somewhere by Lewis Wallace, and it's really about this idea of objectivity in journalism, and I would really highly recommend it, because Lewis has done a lot of research and thinking about what these rules are and why we abide by them, much more so than myself. But at the same time, the way that I try to navigate that space is that I'm interested in being of service, and that's my orientation towards journalism. And I feel like I don't really, I don't have a real service to provide on the opinion side. So I don't feel like my voice is necessary. But I think if I really felt like I needed to lend my voice and it was an opinion rather than like some reporting, that I don't think I would feel necessarily bad about doing that. I would know that there were consequences for that, but I felt that I can express myself plenty because I have the job that I have, and I'm my own assignment editor, right? Like, along with the people of the city of Detroit, like, that's a lot of power, and I don't really feel like I need to take up any more space. But again, that's because that's just not my personality. I'm not one to say that it's wrong.
Cool. With fewer than about 10 minutes left, I want to get to some solutions, right? Martina's done an excellent job laying out the landscape in terms of where we are and aren't in terms of covering communities of color. Let's talk about some solutions. I'll throw it open to you guys. What about advisory councils? What about media organizations making a conscious effort saying, we are going to not only seek story ideas or look for a sounding board from a community advisory council of some type. Not only do that, but it may help drive our coverage, develop relationships, come up with good story ideas. And is that a line that journalists don't want to do? I don't want to be too close to the block club captain or pastor so-and-so. I need a level of objectivity and some, a sort of firewall. Is that in bounds or out of bounds? Community advisory councils of some type.
I guess it depends on how it's structured. I don't, I'm not so sure. I know media news outlets don't want to get into the business of being told what to report.
Why not, Vince? Why not? If it is in fact the community that you cover. I'm just playing devil's
that
advocate.
goes to this whole, I think Martina mentioned it in her presentation, the whole, or at least she mentioned it in her piece, the whole us and y'all. We know what y'all want.
But how?
Well, they don't.
Right.
They don't.
I'm just playing out some of the play through that.
So I have to think about that some more. I think it could be a good thing depending on how it's structured, depending on what kind of feedback is being asked of for the lack to use your term, advisory council. How often their advice is sought, and whether news media outlets who would do something like that would even pay attention to what the feedback they So I'd have to give that some thought before I.
Fair. That's fair. What do you think, Sarah?
I think that there are like a lot of ways that news organizations could design systems to get more input. And I think that I would be fine with an advisory council, but I think that what a solution really is to design some kind of process, or maybe more than one, where all of the decision making about what's important and who's important is not happening inside a newsroom, right? That's what's really key, is taking those decisions outside of, just a newsroom or one journalist's head and making that a more open process. And I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I think what's important is that it's happening. And I think that an advisory council could do that, or it could just replace the voice in some, your own voice in your head with somebody else's strong voice. So in that case, are you really being more responsive to needs, or are you just meeting one person's need? I will say what we try to do is, everybody can design their own way, and I don't think ours is better than anybody else's, but the way that we try to make sure that we're doing our job is that we want to answer everybody's question. And that's our goal, is to answer people's questions that are in front of us and to fill those information gaps person by person, and then pick up on stories outside of that. But because you never know, if you're doing a good job, the way that you can tell is by saying, was I able to answer your question? Did I give you information that you need? Yes? Okay, well then at least I've done something, right?
Gotcha. Curt, any reaction? I don't want to come back to this.
Well, in general,
You don't have to join.
No, but in general, I think the more input, the better.
Right.
You can make a decision on how to act on it, but it's the wider you cast the net, the better off you're going to be, which gets back to the diversity issue. You're casting a wider net, the more diverse you are.
The newsroom is, or the organization.
And so that's an extension of that philosophy. But again, you also have to be willing to alienate people. Or I think the movie Spotlight, I think it would be interesting to teach a journalism class using movies to help teach certain things. And Spotlight did a really good job in a lot of ways, but one of it is, much of the community was Catholic and very invested in not seeing the Catholic faith portrayed in a negative way. And so you saw in that movie how people who were in a community had to risk alienate themselves from people that they're friends with in order to tell the truth. And that's what it really comes down to as the bottom line is telling the truth. It's sort of like the objectivity thing, to come back to that, which is, to me, objectivity can obscure the truth. We saw a lot, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, even into the 2000s, the issue of climate change. And when that was reported on, they would report on what scientists were saying, talking about how this is real, and then they would talk to others who would say, well, we don't know. And those are a lot of times people at think tanks being funded by the fossil fuel industry. But, being strictly objective, you say, well, this side says this side says this, decide for yourself. In the alternative press, it was this side says this, and this side says this, but that's bullshit. And here's why it's bullshit, right? But that's not being objective, but it is telling the truth. But you have to be fair and you have to be right. When you say it's bullshit, you have to be able to back up why it's bullshit. And so, again, I think objectivity can actually be an impediment to connecting with communities. Because if you're not telling the truth, people are going to know.
I thought of perhaps one way that I saw something recently, an idea that I really like, and I may steal it from them. The Detroit Journalists of Color is in a few weeks, about to do a program in which they've invited news managers from various outlets in town to come, and they've invited community folk to come and pitch their stories. Okay. Now that's one way to get at that. I like that idea. That way managers get out of the newsroom, get to meet people, and get to hear stories that they probably don't even know exist out here from various communities around the city, right? Yeah. So I think that's one way to do that. And I like that.
And the Free Press just hired, I think they announced today,
Yeah.
or a neighborhood reporter. So like credit where
An
credit is
African
due.
American young man.
Yeah, that they hired from the
Beautiful
Congress.
thing.
Good job.
Brandon Hunter, as a matter of fact.
Right. So yeah, I do think people want to do. Part of this is just that it's hard to change, right? And it's hard for any institution to change, and it's of course hard for journalism institutions to change.
So we've talked about what I call community advisory council, some type of structure that the institution might put together as a way of better connecting with the community and a way of building trust. Vincent, what strikes me as very interesting about your role as president of the National Association of Black Journalists, the Detroit chapter is, and I've been a member of that organization off and on for the last 25 or 26 years. DC and ABJ has often come out and taken strong positions about compositions of newsrooms, sometimes about reporting that has come out of an outlet that might have been deemed offensive. What's the role of affinity groups or advocacy groups of journalists like NABJ in helping to build this trust in communities? And if there, you should probably point out to our audience some examples, maybe recent examples or examples over time that sort of point out or illustrate the advocacy that the organizations have.
You're just trying to get me in trouble.
Stirring up the pot.
Well, our role locally, Detroit chapter in ABJ and in ABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, nationally, is that to be an advocate for Black journalists around the country and in this town for the chapter, and that is to do not only in terms of hiring and training those, helping them with skill sets and helping them get jobs, but also to advocate for them inside their workplaces. And when we are made aware of issues of bias against them, or perhaps in coverage of the story, then we do respond. The most recent one that we reacted to was the issue with Kevin Adele, the owner of 910 AM, and this meme of preachers. And some, you might know what I'm talking about, because I have to tread lightly when I talk about this, for reasons that you may understand. But we put out a very strong statement condemning this portrayal of this meme that he shared. We have no doubt that he didn't create it, that he shared it, but he is the white owner of a media outlet, radio station, that is, whose listeners are predominantly black and whose hosts are predominantly black. And when a meme portrays you in a fur coat and a fur-brimmed hat and creatures surrounded around you and can I say host? As your host, that's the problem. So we issued a statement on that, sent him a letter, demanded he apologize. He has not. He demanded we retract the statement. We have not. We asked for a meeting with him, and that's where we are. So that's
see a role.
So that's the role that we definitely see a role for us. Because while we do a lot of programming to help our membership with skill sets and those kinds of things, and we do fundraising events, our role is to advocate for Black journalists in this town. Journalists anywhere, period, but particularly Black journalists in this town.
We're going to be turning to Q&A in a little bit.
Okay, all right. So any reaction,
groups within the journalism institution to advocate for a stronger composition of color in newsrooms in a place like Detroit that is 80-85% people of color. I mean, I know you pointed out that at least as an individual, the joining thing is not something that you really see yourself doing, but if you are a member of an affinity group within that vocation, do you see a difference there?
Well, someone that works for an advocacy organization.
I'm trying to throw you a softball.
No, it's you're just exerting influence and sticking up for what you think is right. Everybody should be willing to stick up for what they think is right, regardless of the consequences. And if you're going to take the hits, then you take the hits. But it's a matter of principle, to stand up and talk about what you believe in, to point out things that you think are wrong. That's fundamental to being a journalist. And so it's just an extension of that philosophy, I think.
Sarah, any thought on that?
No.
Well, I mean, I want to get back to what I've been sort of trying to beat a drum. I mean, I go through newsrooms all the time, and they don't look like the city proper. I mean, what are some ways in which, we talked about solutions, what are some ways in which we strike more of a balance? The newsrooms look more like the communities that they cover. I mean, Vince, is it that, I've heard people say, and going into the realm of sports, well, Black American kids don't like baseball. That's why you don't see a lot of African American center fielders and starting pitchers. I mean, is it that kids aren't going to J schools? Is it that Black kids that grew up in Detroit aren't interested in journalism? Why aren't there more people of color in these newsrooms?
Well, one, we probably need to get away from this mindset that good journalists are solely found in J schools. Let's broaden the pipeline. Case in point, Brandon Hunter, who was just recently hired to speak as their neighborhood reporter for the Free Press. He didn't go to J school.
Not a traditional.
He's not a traditional journalist. At least through the route of going to J school. He's just did 2 years at the Michigan Chronicle as well, and he's doing various other things around town. So I think we need to find different pipelines, not to the exclusion of J schools, journalism schools, but and when you have the diversity of media outlets that you have now, not all those folks have gone to J school. But that does not mean that they don't have something to offer to traditional legacy media outlets.
I didn't go to J school either. But I do think that we have to, one way to, I'm not sure, of course we should be aiming for workplaces and news institutions that are more reflective of the communities that they serve. That is, of course, true. It is also a really hard profession where you don't get paid very well, and there's not a lot of job security. So also, I'm not sure that I would, be telling my kids if they were like, I want to be a reporter, I'd be like, great, that sounds unstable, So what I feel like, I would like to see newsrooms be different, but I also want to see the newsrooms that exist, even those that are reflective of the communities that they serve, try to be more encompassing of different groups in the community. And I've heard some people talk about this as acts of journalism, right? That you want to support acts of journalism. So maybe it comes from a place that you would not necessarily expect. And I think the Movement for Black Lives is a really good example of that, where a lot of the work that they were doing around data about police stops and about brutality was not coming out of a newsroom, right? It was coming out of a movement, but then it ended up really changing coverage in the entire country. I do think that if you are a newsroom trying to support that type of work at a community level, that you have to really have like some fact check processes. You have to have a process around it. But I think that that's one way that we can be more supportive of younger people, of more people of color, of people who didn't go through J schools. Like, I think that that's also one way to do it, is not to get everybody in the newsroom, but to get the newsroom supporting more people.
I remember showing my age, but when I was growing up in this town in the 80s, and becoming a journalist in the early 90s, one of the people that I had come to really respect, and came to respect him even more when I actually met him, was a gentleman named Bill Black. Bill Black had been a City Hall reporter at WJR. He had started his reporting career at the Michigan Chronicle, and to the point I think you were getting at, Vincent, he wasn't a traditional journalist. He actually sold cars and worked on a factory, worked on an automobile factory, but had the desire to write a report. And Bill Black is in the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame, and so untraditional course, but turned out to be. And when Curt, you'll probably remember when Black died in '92, he was thought to be called oftentimes the dean of City Hall reporters. He had gained, earned so much respect from people in the industry and outside of it. We're going to go to a couple questions that are in the audience, from the audience, and there's some really good ones here. I want to get right to the gist of this question, though. Are there any markets that are getting it right? Are there examples of news organizations, maybe in another market, maybe in another part of the state, maybe somebody who's getting it right in our backyard? Vince, you worked in a couple different markets, to be sure. Is anybody getting at this, doing it right, building trust in communities, knocking down the disconnection, and pushing back against mistrust that you could sort of think of, come to mind? And that might just be the point there, right?
It's hard. It's hard work. It really is. And when you're in an environment now of retrenchment, particularly in legacy media, in retrenchment, tight budgets, fewer reporters, trying to figure out how to do that. So the challenge is trying to figure out how to do it. What I'm more interested in is trying to think of outlets that are thinking about it and trying to do it. I suspect there are some out there. None comes to mind readily, but there are some, I suspect, that are out there trying to do what we've been talking about tonight. But I understand it's hard, but just because it's hard doesn't mean it should not be done.
There's like, in Chicago, I think Martina mentioned City Bureau. They're a really interesting outlet, great people. And I think there are a lot much smaller kind of like startup organizations, right, that are, I heard somebody say this the other day, there's also an organization called Free Press, and it's based out of New Jersey and North Carolina, and they try to do a lot of training for community groups and newsrooms. But I heard them say something the other day, one of their trainers, Alicia Bell, and she said like moving at the speed of trust, which I was like, that sounds slow. But, maybe appropriate. So I feel like maybe that's kind of the framework that you want to look at, like who's moving at the speed of trust. And I think that there probably are a lot of people out there, but we're local, so we don't know. BT Digger in Vermont is pretty amazing, and they do a lot of like great watchdog investigative work. I think there are a lot of people out there probably, but it's hard to know. It's a busy landscape. Anybody you want to shout out?
Yeah, Bridge Magazine. I think Bridge Magazine is probably the best news organization in the state at this point. They do great work, and that's based on a nonprofit model. And I think that that probably frees them up in a certain way. They don't have to be worried about alienating advertisers by what they report. So I think that they do a really good job.
Is that the new way?
It's one of the
nonprofit
ways.
media. One of the ways it's certainly growing. I mean, Rick seems to be hiring news and free press people almost.
And nationally, like ProPublica does outstanding work. And, you know, they might not have the readers directly, but what happens is that they produce such blockbuster stuff that the other media covers what they're reporting on. And so that is definitely a newer development that is, I think, having a very positive effect on things.
Let me stay with you, Curt. You happen to be the person on the panel who's the white guy. Question for Isaac. Do you, if as a white guy working, and I'm going to take you out of alternative press, I'm going to put you in a legacy newsroom. Do you think there is a financial disinvestment, a legacy white organization reporting on issues that are important to the Black community? I mean, will you lose readers or get fewer clicks, or is there some suffering that will happen on the business side because you're covering issues that are thought to be African American issues? Let's say Black Lives Matter.
Yes, in part because, let's take the News and Free Press. I mean, they're located in a city of maybe 700,000 people that is 80% African American, but their market isn't just Detroit. Their market is all of Southeast Michigan and even further. And what they are selling is readers to advertisers. And advertisers want their readers to have money in order to spend money on what they are selling. And so I think to a certain extent that part of the business model is what stories are we going to do that are going to attract the kind of readers that advertisers want us to have. And I can tell you, at the Metro Times, once the Craigslist effect and all this online stuff that cut into the profits started to take hold, they cut back their circulation from a high of maybe 110,000 to 50,000. And when they were cutting circulation, where they were cutting it was a lot of places in Detroit, because they wanted it to be where they would have an audience that would appeal to advertisers. So, the whole business model definitely figures into the way things get covered.
When I was a reporter at the Michigan Chronicle, the late Sam Logan was a longtime publisher there. Told me a story once that he had with Mike Ilitch of Little Caesars Pizza fame. And the story went sort of like this. If you remember Sam was publisher of the Michigan Chronicle, strong sales background, sometimes controversial for being more of a salesman than a journalist in the traditional sense. But Logan sits down with Mike Ilitch and says, listen, Mr. Ilitch, I mean, Black folks buy pizza too. Why? In an effort, Sam was in an effort to get Little Caesars to buy a full-page ad every once in a while, like they were doing it with the News and Free Press. And Ilitch told Sam in no sort of terms, listen, I mean, why would I buy an ad with you guys? Your people buy my product without that. It is probably a conversation that's probably had in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it might not be as candid as that, but these organizations oftentimes, unless you're going to the nonprofit model, we're seeing more. I mean, these are business organizations, and they're making decisions sometimes based on the business side.
Another aspect of that, which is in 2015, Donald Trump was getting way disproportionate amount of coverage. Not because anybody in the media thought he was a good candidate, but because he was getting viewers. And so when you look at the studies that show the amount of media attention he was getting, it was because he was getting clicks, he was getting viewers. And so, in that way, capitalism is undermining good journalism. And that's most, strongest example of that there is. But like you say, it happens all the time, I think.
Sarah, okay.
Oh, I just want to say real quick that that story is so bad. Everything is wrong with that. But I think it can happen. Business leaders can do it, and journalists can do it too. Like, it's an undervaluing of people that is not appropriate. And I do think that that's why news consumers have been undervalued, and particularly low-income news consumers people act like low-income people don't buy stuff. Low-income people buy stuff all the time, every day, right? They're not buying your product because it's not of high enough value. And that is often, I think news organizations want to put that on a consumer, but it's not. It's on the news organization to develop a product that is of high enough value, right? For somebody to spend money on, especially if they have less.
I hear what Curt is saying about the business model, but for legacy media, the business model is not working now.
Right.
So something needs to be done different. And Curt didn't suggest this, and I'm about to say I'm not saying he suggested this, but for any news outlet that is concerned about whether they do cover too much of a particular community, particularly a black community or other people of color communities that may offend their white readers, don't need to be in business.
That's right.
Period.
Martina, I know you had a comment.
I did. I just wanted
That's
to,
the
because
point.
I found this question so fascinating. And when you talk about sort of corporate media, the model is just getting kind of worse and worse. The fact that so fewer people own, these outlets is a problem. This is what happened well over 100 years ago, or several hundred years ago, when they invented the penny press. The journalism was owned by a few people, and their stories told by these other few people, and they would just tell stories about themselves. And they had complete control of it. It was like a PR outlet. And then the penny press was invented, right? And then all of a sudden, everybody could have their own newspaper. And that is the birth, that is the advent of journalism as we know it now. And the internet did that for us again, because this model kept going in a direction where it wasn't, not only the corporate model wasn't right and that it kept consolidating, but they weren't treating their workers right. If you remember the Detroit Free Press strike, in the 90s, that was how they treated the people who worked at the Detroit Free Press is considered one of these monumental moments in labor history, right? Because people boycotted the free press because of it. This was a corporate decision, and they never recovered. Hundreds and hundreds of people stopped buying the free press because of that strike.
Some people have never gone back to buying.
Exactly, and so
Some
they
people
never went back.
to
So it
work.
wasn't just advertisers, it was the fact that you made a corporate decision that undermined workers in a city that valued workers, and they stopped buying your product. So to think that that's not gonna happen is sort of insane. Another point was in terms of writing about or reporting on communities of color, there's actual evidence, there are reports done on this, where you cover communities of color comprehensively, in addition to what everything else is covered, you get more readers, you get more advertisers. This idea that, it's something that's like a sidebar is insane, it's ridiculous. Because it's already been proven to be true. And, forgive me, I can't remember the name of the study, but I'm happy to look it up and shoot it out. That you do get more if you do this. So it shouldn't be somehow that this pandering to Southeast Michigan and to see who is gonna buy ads or not is part of this super flawed corporate model that needs to be really looked at and reinvented.
All right.
Well, as I'm looking at the clock and we have to close. Lots of great questions. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to all of them. But as we do close, I want each of you, Vincent, Sarah, and Curt, to spend a minute or so, no more than 2 minutes, closing out. And I'd like to have us move forward in the vein of solutions, lifting up an idea or a concept that you think might build more trust between the journalism community and the folks that it covers. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I'm going to start with Sarah.
Oh, okay. But yes, you are.
Right.
Well, I guess to close it out, I would say thank you guys for coming and caring about this. That's shocking and also wonderful. And I think to improve trust, what I would recommend is that you demand more from your news organizations and expect that your expectations be met, right? Like, you have a lot of power as sources for stories, and I think that you should exercise that power as much as you can. Because if news organizations do respond to pressure, and we already know that people do want to do their job really well, so I think it's partly on all of us to demand more.
Good.
Okay, here.
Again, thanks for the invitation from Nora and Martina. Thanks to all who've come out. I kind of want to echo what Sarah said. I think it's, it should be, and it can be a two-way street with media outlets, their readers, or their viewers. But that audience has to engage also. Don't just read something and get upset about it and keep moving. If it bothers you that much, or if you think that there is a lack of coverage on something that you think that outlet should be covering, or those outlets should be covering, let them know. And don't do it by social media. Find out who's in charge. Find out who the managers are. Find out who the editors are.
Phone call, email.
All of that. All of that.
Leadership team.
The leadership team, the assignment editors, and let them know. Let them know how you feel, and seek a response. Don't just let it sort of get lost. But I think it's a two-way street also for the community to be engaged.
Well, on the side of the media, they just have to show not just a willingness, but a desire to take on existing power structures. You know, the example of Little Caesars Arena and how it took a media outlet from outside the city to do this reporting that exposed what was going on, and that sort of gave permission for local media to then, sort of say something critical of this power structure because, well, we're not really initiating it, we're just following up on what someone else is reporting. There's no way in the world there should have been an outside media outlet that exposed that outrageous situation. But they got to have the guts to do it. If they think if your readers think you're a lapdog, then they're not going to have any respect for you, they're not going to value you. If you show that you're really fighting on their behalf, if you're taking on DTE and the Illiches and Rock Financial and Dan Gilbert who owns the building that they're working out of, you got to have the guts to do it if you're going to build trust. That would be my opinion.
Right. The doors of the church are open. Okay, absolutely.
I know it's like we're on a roll now, so I can't help it. I'm sorry.
You, Martina.
Huh?
There's a question behind
Oh, there's a question.
We do have to close.
Okay.
We've got to close.
I'm just going to say this and then we're going to close. But there's also an issue, and I agree 100% with you, of cultural competency, right? Like that when you hire journalists of color, there's this way of being in corporate media newsrooms that you want to hire the ones who has the fanciest degree, right? Or the one that had the right internship or was at the right news outlet before, right? But you don't consider that the black girl that may have applied for that job knows that community so intimately and can navigate in the community and knows the leaders in a way that I don't care how many schools you went to, you will never know. And that value, that cultural competency value, should override all kinds of degrees and internships. as far as I'm concerned. And this is a shift in the editorial way of thinking, you know? And you don't have to be black to be culturally competent, but if you're gonna report in a community, right, let's say these are the reporters I got, and this is all I have for right now, then you know what, they need to be out living in that community, breathing that community, and knowing who the players are too. Then they can become culturally competent. Like, the onus shouldn't be on always the journalists of color or on the readers. You know, you have to change too. And I know that media has been sort of entrenched in a corporate model, but if we don't break out of it now, like, what does that mean for journalism in the 21st century? We have to change, and we have to sort of stop our ways of being.
All right, let's give Martina Guzmán, Curt Guyette, Sarah Alvarez, and Vincent McCraw. Give them all a hand.
Thank you all so much. I am going to keep you for another 30 seconds. And what I want to say is, you know, I don't think there is a silver bullet answer to any of this. It's going to take all of us over a long period. And what we bit off tonight was one thing, one small piece of it. It is really an honor to have listened to all of you. And to the extent that you are asking for more from readers, I think you being here is you giving more of yourselves. And so thank you for your time. And Martina, thank you for your wonderful case study. And I'll close by just saying thank you to our many co-sponsors. And thank you, of course, to the Damon J Center for Civil Rights. We will all be around mingling for questions, anything that, if you have time, we will be around. Thank you.
All right.